She just wanted to survive, but one stormy night and a desperate scream would change everything. What Jane found in that abandoned building would transform not only her life but also that of a stranger who needed her more than she could have imagined. A story of courage, renewal, and an unexpected bond that would defy the impossible. Jane was a shadow of the person she had once dreamed of becoming. At 18, she lived in a public shelter, a space meant to offer refuge but that felt more like a prison for weary souls. The walls were cold, the air heavy with judgmental stares, and each day began and ended with the same battle: how to survive. Gratitude was a distant, almost unreal concept. Her days were spent searching for small jobs that barely covered her meals, while she avoided conflicts with the other residents, each carrying their own invisible scars. The shelter was a place where stories of pain crossed paths, but no one dared to share them. Jane remained silent, isolated by both choice and necessity. The weight of her past rested heavily on her shoulders, as if every unspoken word was a stone keeping her from moving forward. She had left her hometown behind, a place where violence and shouting were the soundtrack of her daily life. Finding inspiration seemed like a cruel joke. The only drive she had ever known was the instinct to escape, which had brought her here. On quiet nights, Jane often imagined a different world. The city's noise outside seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of a life beyond her reach. There were moments when she wondered if she would ever be able to dream again, to stop merely surviving and start truly living. But reality pulled her back, reminding her that every small victory was just that, small. Tomorrow felt like a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford. Still, within all that despair, a stubborn spark refused to die. Jane would watch the other young women in the shelter, and in rare moments of reflection, she realized she wasn't the only one carrying a heavy past. This didn't diminish her own pain, but it gave her a sense of shared humanity. Perhaps, she thought, there might be something beyond this harsh existence. Feeling gratitude for simply being alive was the closest she could get to hope. The days were gray, and moments of relief were scarce. The shelter had strict rules, and any misstep could mean expulsion. Jane constantly felt watched, as if being judged by an invisible court. In her rare moments of respite, she tried to remember what it felt like to feel safe. Perhaps that was what she truly sought, a place where her story wasn't a sentence but a chance to begin anew. As cruel as her routine was, it had become a comfort zone for Jane. Anything outside the predictable cycle seemed terrifying. She knew how to navigate the shelter, its hostilities, and the solitude. What she didn't know was whether she had the strength to face something greater. And so, for a long time, she stayed exactly where she was, unmoving as the world around her kept spinning. Even so, Jane's mind was a storm of thoughts. She wondered how anyone could find inspiration in a place so bleak. There was something within her that longed for change, but her fear of failure outweighed her desire to try. Each time she looked at the sky, the weight of life made her lower her head again. The rain that often fell seemed like a reflection of her own repressed tears, hidden by exhaustion. Amid the chaos, Jane found a small routine that gave her a sense of control: walking the city streets after work. These walks were a time to process her thoughts, away from the voices and suffocating atmosphere of the shelter. The city seemed endless, full of possibilities she didn't dare explore. Yet, there was something comforting about feeling part of something larger, even if just for a moment. One night, as she gazed at the city lights, something inside Jane began to shift. She realized that, despite everything, she was still here. Breathing, walking, existing. Gratitude wasn't easy for her, but perhaps it could be a starting point. And so, with a mix of resignation and hope, Jane carried on. What she didn't know was that her life was about to change irreversibly. A storm was approaching, and with it, a scream that would echo deep within her soul. It was a stormy night, the kind where lights flickered and the wind howled through empty streets. Jane walked with her shoulders hunched, her worn hoodie soaked through by the relentless rain. Her shift, her only chance at earning money that week, had been canceled due to the storm, leaving her aimless, shelterless, and hungry. Each step on the wet pavement felt heavier, as though the entire world was conspiring against her. The sky roared, and all Jane wanted was to disappear into the darkness. She found temporary refuge under an awning, but the biting cold and the howling wind wouldn't let her stay long. She was about to resume her walk when a strange sound broke through the monotony of the rain. A scream. It wasn't just any scream, it was a sound filled with pain, raw and desperate. Jane froze, her heart racing. Something inside her urged her to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't heard. After all, what could someone like her do? The scream repeated, weaker this time but no less anguished. Jane scanned her surroundings, searching for its source. Her eyes landed on an abandoned building, a hulking mass of concrete adorned with graffiti and broken windows. The sound was coming from there. Jane took a deep breath, trying to decide. Her mind told her to leave, but her heart wouldn't let her take another step in the opposite direction. A lump formed in her throat. Every fiber of her being screamed not to get involved. "This isn't your problem," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. But curiosity, mixed with something deeper, perhaps a compassion she barely understood, made her hesitate. Her feet began to move, almost against her will, toward the building. The rain muffled her footsteps, and she clenched her hands to steady her trembling. She had no idea what she would find inside, but something told her it wouldn't be easy. At the building's entrance, Jane paused, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The air smelled of mold and dampness, and the atmosphere felt even more foreboding with the thunder rumbling in the background. The scream had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. She almost turned back, but the memory of that anguished sound, so vivid it was as if she could see it, still reverberated in her mind. "You've been through so much," she thought. "You can't just walk away." Stepping cautiously inside, Jane felt the wet floor beneath her feet and the cold seeping through her clothes. Each step made her breathing heavier. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice came out weaker than she expected, and the echo in the building seemed to mock her. Silence answered her, and for a moment, she thought it had all been in her imagination. But then, a low groan came from a distant corner. Following the sound, she found a man on the ground, curled up like a lost child. He was injured, his clothes torn and stained with dark patches she immediately recognized as blood. Jane froze, her heart racing. Fear clawed at her, threatening to take control, but the sight of this vulnerable man was stronger. It was as if she were staring at a part of herself, something she couldn't ignore. Jane knew she had to do something. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, even though it was clear he wasn't. The man opened his eyes with difficulty, his expression a mix of confusion and pain. "Help me," he murmured, barely audible. A lump rose in Jane's throat as she glanced around, desperate to find anything that might help. But there was no one else to turn to, no one else to save him. It was just her and this stranger. Suddenly, the storm outside felt like a perfect metaphor for the one raging inside her. She wasn't a doctor, nor did she have any idea how to handle such a situation, but something inside her insisted she couldn't leave him there. She remembered all the times she had felt like no one cared about her and knew she couldn't do the same to him. Hesitating, she took a step closer, trying not to focus on all the things that could go wrong. The rain seemed to pound harder, as though the world outside wanted to erase what was happening here. But Jane was determined not to run away this time. Jane felt the weight of responsibility as she moved closer to the man. He was badly hurt, and the blood on his shirt told her how serious this was. She swallowed hard, her thoughts spinning in frantic circles. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself. Fear consumed her, and the urge to run seemed like the safest choice. After all, who was she to save anyone? She could barely take care of herself. But for some reason, her feet refused to move. As she watched the man, who now seemed to be trying to shift, the voice of doubt screamed in her mind. What if this is a trap? What if I make things worse for myself? Logic tried to take over, but the vulnerability she saw in him mirrored her own. She recognized that look, that desperation. It was the same she had carried silently for years, hoping someone would notice her pain. That memory was what kept her rooted there for just a little longer. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice trembling as she glanced around, half hoping someone else would appear to help them. The man raised his eyes with difficulty, his breathing labored. "Please, was all he managed before coughing. The lump in Jane's throat tightened. She had no tools, no knowledge of what to do, but the guilt of walking away would have been unbearable. Then came the hardest part, making a decision. It felt as though her entire body was torn between reason and emotion. She hesitated for a few more seconds, just long enough to think about all the times she had wished someone had been brave for her. She didn't know if it was empathy or something deeper, but she felt the need to stay. Maybe that was why she was here tonight, even though she had no idea what it all meant. "All right," she murmured, more to herself than to him. With trembling hands, she began rummaging through her backpack, searching for anything that might help. The fear was still there, but Jane began to move. She found an old piece of cloth at the bottom of her bag, something she kept for emergencies. It wasn't ideal, but it was all she had. She tore the fabric into strips, trying not to think about the blood or the gravity of the situation. "It's going to be okay," she said, though she didn't fully believe it. Her hands shook as she pressed the cloth against his wound, but strangely, the act of doing something helped her focus. As she worked, Jane realized her mind was beginning to calm. There was a strength in her she hadn't recognized before. The man muttered incoherent words, but she couldn't make them out. Her sole focus was on keeping him awake and preventing things from getting worse. "Don't fall asleep, okay?" she said, her voice firmer than she expected. The rain continued to pour, but now it was just a distant hum, background noise to what truly mattered. Every minute, Jane felt a mix of fear and determination growing inside her. It wasn't just an instinct to help, it was something deeper, a need to prove to herself that she could do something right, even in the midst of chaos. The weight of her decisions still pressed down on her, but she began to see a glimmer of light in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, there was something inside her worth exploring. As she pressed the fabric against the man's wound, she looked more closely at him. His features were pale, but there was something in his eyes, even through the pain, that made her feel he was still there. "We'll get through this," she whispered, unsure if it was a promise for him or for herself. Deep down, Jane knew there was much more to come. This was only the first of many choices that would change her life forever. Jane stared at the injured man in front of her, trying to piece together how things had escalated so quickly. He opened his eyes and murmured something almost inaudible. "I was attacked, help me." The fragility in his voice cut through her like a blade. He introduced himself as Tom, and he seemed as lost as she was, though his pleading eyes carried a weight Jane couldn't ignore. Despite her doubts, a connection began to form, fragile but undeniable, amid the chaos. As Jane pressed the makeshift bandages against his wounds, she tried to keep him awake by talking. Tom, despite his condition, tried to respond. He told her, in fragmented sentences, how he had once been a successful businessman but had lost everything after a devastating divorce. It was hard to believe this man, crumpled on the ground, had once had it all. Yet Jane recognized the pain of loss in his voice, a reflection of her own shattered life. "You shouldn't be here," he said suddenly, a mix of gratitude and guilt in his expression. Jane let out a nervous laugh, unsure of how to respond. "I guess neither of us should, huh?" she replied, trying to ease the weight of the moment. But even as she made the casual remark, the words echoed in her mind. Somehow they felt true. Maybe this improbable encounter wasn't just coincidence. Maybe they were meant to cross paths. Despite his pain, Tom seemed determined not to lose consciousness. Jane found herself admiring his resilience, though she wouldn't admit it. He guided her as best he could, suggesting she look around for anything useful. "You're braver than you think," he said, his voice weak but sincere. Jane almost laughed, finding the idea absurd, but those words lingered. In the midst of the storm, it was as if he was giving her a bit of his strength. As they waited for the ambulance, Jane realized that, in some strange way, this stranger was helping her more than she was helping him. He wasn't offering solutions or answers to her problems, but his vulnerability made her feel needed. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Gratitude began to well up inside her, not for the situation itself but for the courage she was discovering within herself. When the sound of sirens finally broke through the noise of the rain, Jane felt a mix of relief and panic. She had done her part, but what came next? As the paramedics attended to Tom, he held her hand for a moment, his gaze steady despite the pain. "You saved me," he murmured. Jane wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't a big deal, but the lump in her throat stopped her. That small gesture was enough to make her feel that, for the first time in a long while, she had done something that truly mattered. As the rescue team prepared to lift Tom onto the stretcher, he looked at Jane and said something that left her speechless. "Don't leave me alone." The words took her by surprise. They didn't make sense to her. They were strangers, brought together by bizarre circumstances. And yet, she felt she couldn't walk away. There was something larger at play, something she didn't yet understand but that felt impossible to ignore. Before she could overthink it, Jane found herself climbing into the ambulance alongside Tom. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension and urgency, yet, strangely, she felt a sense of calm. Maybe it was because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't running away. "It's going to be okay," she told herself as the vehicle sped through the dark city streets. What she didn't know was that this decision would mark the beginning of a change that would completely transform her life. Sitting beside Tom in the ambulance, Jane felt out of place, like she didn't belong in the scene unfolding around her. The sharp smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of medical equipment monitoring Tom's vitals only made her more uneasy. She stared down at her hands, still stained with his blood, trying to process what had just happened. The voice of one of the paramedics barked orders in the background, but it was like white noise. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's story. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical staff sprang into action, surrounding Tom in a whirlwind of activity. Jane was left standing in the hallway, frozen and unsure of what to do. Her first instinct was to leave. No one expected her to stay, and maybe no one would notice if she just disappeared. But as she turned to walk away, something stopped her. The memory of Tom's look, so full of need and oddly gratitude, flashed in her mind. She took a deep breath and decided to wait. Minutes stretched into hours as Jane sat in the waiting area, hugging her knees and watching the clock on the wall tick away. Why was she still there? She couldn't quite figure it out. Maybe it was because, for the first time, someone had truly needed her. That feeling, strange and uncomfortable, was also oddly reassuring. She didn't know what to expect when the doctors finally came to speak with her, but leaving felt impossible. "He's stable," a nurse said, snapping Jane out of her thoughts. "Are you family?" The question caught her off guard, and before she could say no, the nurse added, "He asked for you to stay." Those words completely disarmed her. Why would Tom want her there? They barely knew each other. Yet, there was something in the nurse's tone that made it clear he genuinely needed her. Once again, Jane felt the weight of a decision pressing down on her. Walking through the hospital corridors, Jane hesitated outside Tom's room. Through the window, she saw him lying there, fragile and surrounded by tubes and monitors. But his eyes were open, and when they met hers, they lit up with recognition. "I didn't think you'd stay," he said, his voice weak but carrying a note of relief. Jane shrugged, trying to seem indifferent. "Didn't have anywhere else to go," she replied, half joking, half serious. The truth was more complicated than that, but she wasn't ready to admit it yet. As they began to talk, the walls between them started to crumble. Tom spoke in fragments about how his life had unraveled. A divorce, financial ruin, and the crushing loneliness that followed. Each word seemed to mirror Jane's own pain. For the first time, she opened up about her past, sharing pieces of her story that she had never told anyone. It felt strange, but in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by beeping machines, an unexpected bond began to form. Tom seemed genuinely interested in Jane's life, something she wasn't used to. "You're stronger than you think," he told her after hearing about her escape from home and her daily struggles at the shelter. Jane laughed bitterly. "If I were strong, my life wouldn't be like this." But Tom shook his head with a seriousness that left her speechless. "Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time you do." Those words lingered with her, longer than she cared to admit. As the night wore on, Jane began to sense that something was shifting inside her. She couldn't quite name it, but staying, choosing not to run, felt like a turning point. For the first time in years, she wasn't completely alone. And strangely, it didn't feel so scary. The fear was still there, but alongside it was a tiny flicker of something new. A hesitant inspiration, maybe, to believe that not everything was hopeless. While watching Tom as he drifted into a fitful sleep, Jane found herself wondering what the next day would bring. The hospital was a temporary space, just like the connection they had begun to build. Or maybe it wasn't. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to go back to the shelter and pretend nothing had happened. What she couldn't know was that, from that moment on, her life was already being reshaped in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Beyond Jane's internal fears, there was also resistance from the system. Lawyers questioned Tom's ability to be a suitable guardian. "He's barely getting back on his feet," they said. Tom had to face his own doubts, confronting the fact that helping Jane would mean sacrificing part of the stability he had only recently regained. But he was determined. For the first time in years, he felt he had a purpose, something bigger than himself. Despite all the challenges, there were small moments of relief that showed them they were on the right path. Jane began to trust Tom, cautiously but steadily. And in turn, Tom found strength in each of her small victories. They weren't alone on this journey. With the support of the social worker and one of Tom's lawyer friends, they began building a strong case for the upcoming hearing that would decide Jane's future. Even so, the road was far from easy. For Jane, the biggest battle was internal, accepting that she deserved this chance and allowing herself to dream again. For Tom, it was proving to everyone, including himself, that he was ready to take on such a responsibility. As they faced these challenges together, a new feeling began to emerge between them, a shared gratitude for how they were transforming not just their own lives but also each other's. The courtroom was a cold, impersonal place, and every echo of footsteps seemed to heighten Jane's anxiety. Sitting beside Tom, she could hardly breathe. The hearing was the decisive moment, and the weight of it all felt crushing. As Tom's lawyer shuffled through papers, Jane kept her eyes glued to the floor, trying to drown out the questions hammering in her mind. What if I'm not enough? What if this is all a mistake? When the judge entered, everyone stood, and Jane felt her legs trembling. It was hard to believe that her entire life could change that day. Every word seemed crucial, every glance a judgment of who she was. Tom sat beside her, attempting to project calm, but she knew he was nervous too. This moment wasn't just about her. It was also about him. His ability to be seen as someone capable of caring, protecting, and starting over. The lawyer began presenting the case. He spoke of Tom's willingness to support Jane, offering her a home, education, and emotional stability. But it didn't take long for the tough questions to surface. The judge asked about Tom's financial condition and his emotional state following recent events in his life. Jane listened, her heart heavy, feeling that every answer was a battle they needed to win together. When it was Jane's turn to speak, she froze. The microphone felt like a wall between her and the rest of the room. The judge's gaze was direct, as though he was trying to see right through her. For a moment, she thought of running away. But then she looked at Tom, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. She talked about her life, how she had fled an abusive home, the difficulties of living in a shelter, and what it meant to have someone who believed in her. The room fell silent as Jane spoke. Her voice trembled, but there was honesty in every word. She didn't try to hide her flaws or gloss over the darkest parts of her story. "I don't know if I deserve this chance," she said, tears filling her eyes. "But I do know that, for the first time, someone saw something in me that I can't see in myself. And that gives me hope." When she finished, the silence lingered for what felt like an eternity. Tom, too, had to open up. He spoke of losing everything. His home, his family, and his sense of purpose, and how meeting Jane had changed his outlook on life. "I'm not just helping her," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "She's helping me too. Because taking care of her has given me a reason to believe that I can still make a difference, that I can still be someone who matters." His words echoed through the room, heavy with sincerity. As the judge took notes, Jane and Tom waited in tense silence. Jane felt as though she had laid everything bare, that there was nothing more to give. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if she would be pushed or if she would learn to fly. Tom lightly took her hand, a small gesture, but one that carried a world of meaning. They were in this together, no matter what. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. "I've reviewed your statements and the documents," he began, his authoritative voice filling the room. Jane's heart pounded, each word stretching out unbearably. There was no way to predict what would come next. This moment wasn't just a verdict. It was a turning point that would shape the course of their lives. Deep down, Jane knew there was no going back. The silence in the room felt endless. Jane could barely breathe as the judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at her and Tom. "This is an unusual case," he began, his voice firm but not without empathy. "What we have here is not just a formal request for guardianship. It's the story of two people trying to rebuild their lives and, in doing so, finding strength in each other." Jane felt the weight of his words settle on her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. When the judge asked for their final statements, Jane felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. She didn't know what else to say. She hadn't rehearsed any grand speeches or thought of the perfect words. All she had was the truth. Taking a deep breath, she started. "I'm not perfect. I don't know if I'm strong enough to make this work, but I do know that, for the first time, I feel like I can try." He made me believe that my story doesn't have to end the way it began. The judge listened intently, never interrupting her. Jane spoke of how Tom had shown her a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. "For years, I thought no one cared, that I was invisible. But he saw me. He believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And that changed everything." Her voice broke toward the end, but she didn't look away. It was as if she were putting her soul on the line, unable to hold back. When it was Tom's turn, his voice was steady, though filled with emotion. "I'm not a hero," he began, looking directly at the judge. "In fact, I was lost when I met Jane. But by helping her, I found something I thought I'd lost forever: purpose. This isn't just about what I can do for her, it's about what we can build together. We're both trying to start over, and that's something I'm not willing to give up on." The sincerity in his words seemed to fill the room. Jane glanced at Tom and for the first time, felt a sense of security that had long eluded her. The judge asked a few more questions, this time directed at the lawyer and social worker present. Time seemed to crawl as everyone waited for the decision. Jane's heart pounded in her chest, threatening to burst. This wasn't just a test of courage, it was a test of faith. At last, the judge closed the folder of documents and looked at them again. "Life has strange ways of bringing people together," he said, almost reflectively. "This is not a conventional case, but it's clear to me that there is something genuine here. Something worth believing in." He paused and Jane held her breath. "I grant temporary guardianship to Mr. Tom. I hope both of you take this opportunity to rebuild your lives." The words barely registered before tears began streaming down Jane's face. It was as if the weight of years of struggle was finally beginning to lift. Tom squeezed her hand firmly, and she noticed that he, too, was emotional. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Gratitude, hope, and relief washed over her in a wave, and she realized that this wasn't the end but the beginning of something entirely new. As they left the courtroom, Jane's legs felt shaky, but something was different now. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, she wasn't alone. The road ahead was uncertain, but the simple fact of having him by her side made her believe that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to start over. And even though she didn't have all the answers, she knew this was a moment she would never forget. When they arrived at the apartment, Jane hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. It wasn't just a door she was crossing. It was an invisible line between her past and her future. The place was simple yet inviting, with modestly decorated walls and a bookshelf packed with books. "Welcome home," Tom said with a hint of humor, drawing a shy smile from her. It felt strange to hear the words home as something possible again. In the first few days, Jane struggled to adjust to her new routine. Having a space to herself was both liberating and terrifying. She didn't know how to handle the feeling of safety, something she had been denied for so long. Tom, on the other hand, made it a point to give her room to explore the new environment at her own pace. He never pushed her but was always there, ready to help whenever she needed it. As the weeks passed, Tom began encouraging her to consider returning to school. "You have so much potential," he would say, his conviction in her abilities something Jane couldn't yet understand. At first, she resisted. The fear of failure loomed larger than the desire to try. But Tom was gentle yet persistent. "It's not about being perfect, it's about taking the first step." Gradually, Jane started to believe he might be right. Between shared conversations and quiet moments, a new rhythm began to emerge. Jane found small joys in simple tasks, like organizing books on the shelves or cooking improvised dinners. For Tom, watching her blossom seemed to ignite a sense of renewal within himself. There was an unspoken exchange between them, a mutual gratitude for being there for one another, not just starting a new chapter but writing an entirely new book. One afternoon, while exploring the apartment, Jane discovered an old, dusty typewriter tucked away in a corner. "Does it work?" she asked curiously. Tom shrugged but encouraged her to try. Sitting before the keyboard, Jane felt something stir deep within her. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, but soon flowed in a torrent she couldn't hold back. It was as if every keystroke freed a part of her that had been hidden for years. In that moment, Jane realized that starting over wasn't just possible, it was necessary. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt equipped to face it. And as Tom watched from a distance, seeing her dive into the world of writing, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not just in her, but in himself for being part of her transformation. Jane often sat in front of the old computer Tom had given her, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Every word she typed felt like a step toward a future she had never dared to imagine. Writing became her refuge, a way to organize the emotions that once overwhelmed her. Day by day, she felt herself growing stronger, braver, and more willing to confront her fears. Meanwhile, Tom was rearranging his life to accommodate Jane's. The apartment, once a constant reminder of his failures, began to feel like a place of endless possibilities. He repainted the walls, tended to the plants, and prepared simple but thoughtful meals. These small gestures meant more to Jane than he could ever know. For her, it was strange yet comforting to be in a place where every detail seemed to say, "You are welcome here." Together, they began to create a routine. In the mornings, Tom would make coffee and leave little notes of encouragement on the table for Jane. In the afternoons, she would explore the city, seeking inspiration for her writing. Evenings were spent sharing stories and laughing over the day's small victories. Their life was simple but rich with meaning. For Jane, it was the first time she could breathe without fear. For Tom, it was like rediscovering himself, piece by piece. Not everything was easy, of course. Jane still battled the ghosts of her past. Some nights were plagued by nightmares that left her waking up in tears, the traumas of her old life haunting her. Tom never pushed her to talk but was always there, offering a cup of tea or a comforting word. "You don't have to face it all at once," he would say. "One step at a time is more than enough." Tom, too, faced his own demons. He knew he carried the scars of his losses, but helping Jane rebuild her life seemed to heal parts of himself as well. There was something powerful about witnessing someone grow, even when the roots were still fragile. Every step forward Jane took reminded him that he, too, could rebuild, and that gave him strength to keep going. One quiet afternoon, Tom came across an old photo while sorting through some papers. It was from his previous life, a snapshot of a man he barely recognized anymore. He showed it to Jane, laughing at how different he looked. "It's strange to think about how much has changed," he said. Jane studied the picture before looking at him. "You look happier now," she said simply. Her words struck something deep in Tom, and for the first time, he realized she might be right. As time went on, Jane began to make plans. Small ones at first, like submitting her short stories to a local journal or considering going back to school. Tom encouraged her at every turn, no matter how modest the idea. He knew what she needed wasn't just support but the freedom to believe in herself. Slowly but surely, Jane's confidence grew, along with a feeling she barely recognized: hope. Amid the challenges and triumphs, one thing became clear to both of them: the journey was far from over. There was still much to learn about themselves and each other. But for the first time, that didn't feel daunting. Every step they took together was proof that the future, with all its uncertainties, could be faced head-on. And that was enough to keep moving forward. The apartment was quiet with a kind of peace Jane had never thought possible. Sitting at the table with papers spread around her, she reviewed her first completed story. Writing had become more than a hobby. It was a way to reclaim her voice, to give life to the parts of herself that fear and trauma had silenced. Each word was a small victory, proof that she was no longer trapped in her past. From a distance, Tom watched her with a mug of coffee in hand and a faint smile on his face. He had always believed in Jane's potential, but seeing her thrive exceeded all his expectations. "It's amazing," he said, pointing to the paper she held. Jane laughed, slightly embarrassed. "You're just saying that because you like me," she joked, though inside, she felt the warmth of his genuine encouragement. For the first time, she believed she might actually be good at something. The path to that moment hadn't been easy. Jane still had days when the weight of her past felt unbearable. But instead of running or hiding, she was learning to face those moments head-on. Writing helped her process her emotions, and Tom's unwavering support reminded her that she wasn't alone. It was a delicate balance, but one she was beginning to master. For Tom, Jane's transformation was a mirror of his own journey. He had spent so much time feeling purposeless, but now, watching someone else flourish gave him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't thought possible. Her courage inspired him to confront his own fears and to believe that he, too, could rebuild. Their relationship was a constant exchange of growth and strength, a mutual journey that made them both stronger. The moment of greatest pride came when Jane submitted her story to a local newspaper. She hesitated for days before pressing the send button, but Tom was there by her side, encouraging her. "The worst that can happen is someone doesn't get it," he said with a reassuring smile. "And the best? Well, I think you already know." When her story was published, Jane felt a mixture of disbelief and pride. For the first time, it felt like the world saw her. With time, Jane opened herself up to new opportunities. She enrolled in a writing course and began attending literary workshops. Each new experience was both a challenge and a chance to grow. Meanwhile, Tom found ways to explore his own interests. He started volunteering at a community center, helping people in vulnerable situations, something that gave him a deep sense of purpose. Their life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt and fear, but the difference was that now they had the tools to face them. Jane was no longer the frightened girl hiding in a shelter, and Tom was no longer the man drowning in his own pain. Together, they had found a way to start anew, not as entirely different people but as stronger, more resilient versions of themselves. One evening, while they were reviewing another one of Jane's chronicles, Tom looked at her with an expression of quiet admiration. "Do you realize how much you've changed?" he asked. Jane paused for a moment before answering, her voice steady and full of determination. "I do. And it gives me the courage to keep changing." Her response was simple but brimming with meaning. It was a testament to the journey they were still on, ready to face whatever came next. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the evening light, and on the main wall, a framed piece of paper stood out, a copy of Jane's first published chronicle. Its words spoke of new beginnings, of two solitary figures who found strength in each other, and of how even the most broken pieces could be mended. For Jane, it was more than just a piece of writing. It was a symbol of her transformation, a milestone in her story. Tom often found his gaze drifting to that frame, as though he could draw a bit of that renewal each time he looked at it. That evening, he glanced at Jane sitting on the couch, a notebook resting in her lap, her eyes distant. "Thinking of something else to write?" he asked with a smile. Jane shrugged, but there was a glimmer in her eyes that Tom recognized as something new. "I'm thinking about what comes next," she replied, her voice light, carrying a hope he knew hadn't always been there. What came next was a future bursting with possibilities. Jane began receiving invitations to participate in local events, where she could share her stories and inspire others. Standing on a stage or speaking to an audience felt strange to her at first, but the experience of being heard filled parts of her she hadn't even realized were empty. Each thank you she received was a reminder that her past didn't define her worth, it only added depth to her voice. While Jane thrived in her world of words, Tom found joy in the subtle but profound changes in his own routine. His apartment had transformed into a true home, with personal touches that reflected their new dynamic. Their relationship wasn't that of father and daughter, nor just casual friends. It was something uniquely their own, built on respect, gratitude, and an undeniable sense of belonging. They were, above all, a family chosen and forged by circumstance. One night, Jane shyly handed Tom a draft of a larger project. A book. He read the first pages in silence, his heart warming with each line. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Jane still doubted herself, but Tom's unwavering confidence in her seemed enough for both of them. "You have a story the world needs to hear," he added as he handed the manuscript back to her. For the first time, Jane believed he might be right. The framed chronicle on the wall became a touchstone for both of them. Whenever things felt overwhelming, and they inevitably did, they would look at it and remember how far they'd come. It was more than a piece of paper behind glass. It was a reminder that they had faced the impossible and come out stronger. "It still feels like a dream," Jane said one day, gazing at the frame. "But it's real," Tom replied. "And you're the one who made it real." The future remained uncertain, as it always does. But now Jane and Tom had something they hadn't before, the confidence that they could face it together. They had turned pain into inspiration, fear into courage, and emptiness into renewal. Most importantly, they had found in each other the strength to keep growing. As they planned their next steps, the apartment seemed to hum with a palpable sense of hope, as tangible as the soft evening light illuminating the framed chronicle. Jane knew the journey wasn't over. She still carried her fears, and Tom still wrestled with his own battles. But they had discovered the power of resilience and mutual support. In the little space they now called home, the two of them continued to write their stories, individual yet intertwined. And somehow, that was more than enough.